I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Adam Moss, Adam Moss has been in sort of my consciousness and my orbit as a bookseller for a really long time because one of his roles has been as editor-in-chief, and this was back in 2004 up until about 2019, where he was running New York Magazine and was doing some cool stuff in print and doing some cool stuff online and just changing the landscape in a lot of ways. And then Adam decided he was going to go be a painter in 2019. And I don't think any of us saw this coming, including him. But now we have this really cool book called The Work of Art. And it's Adam, but it's other creatives. I have to pull this package up so people can see it because this book is crazy beautiful. And I'm really excited to talk to you, Adam, because there's so much ground I want to cover. But what I'm most curious about is why you decided to be a painter.
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. I'm very delighted to be here. I decided to be a painter because I've always, in my whole magazine career, New York Magazine, before that I was the editor of the New York Times Magazine. I go back way back in magazine land. And one of the things about magazines that interested me, that really excited me, was telling stories visually. I mean, I liked a lot of what I did as a magazine editor, but I was particularly interested in the way that words and images came together in a way that was different from books. We'll get to. And I decided as a lark to just try to make images myself. I had some free time up in Provincetown where I also have a house, and our house there is an old art school. It was the Cape Cod School of Art at one time, and kind of mysterious juju thing going on there, and you can kind of see the old painters and in their bonnets and doing plein air on the dunes, and it kind of got into my system. And so one day, just on a lark, I decided I would have a project for my 3-week vacation. I finally worked up to a 3-week vacation where I'd make a painting a day. And I just did, and I loved it. And I came back to New York and I found myself a teacher, and then I got a little bit more serious about it. And then when I decided to leave New York, I just thought, well, look, I'm going to try to actually do this. And I started to paint seriously, which is when everything completely fucked up.
What do you mean? Wait, what?
Well, because before I was doing that, I was doing it as a kind of lark, and there was just all this joy to it. And when I started to paint seriously, that was what I was going to do, I just became a worse painter and certainly a much more frustrated painter. And this was just a total torment for me. And eventually it led to me writing a book where I would talk to other people about how they make art.
Okay. So when did you start all of these interviews? Because there are some very cool people. Barbara Kruger. I was so happy to see Barbara Kruger in this book. And Tony Kushner's in this book, and George Saunders and Wesley Morris. I mean, it's an amazing, Kara Walker. There's an amazing, amazing range of people. John Darien. I had never read an interview with John Darien before. And, his work is so sort of very distinctive. And I'm like, oh,
it is.
Wait, there's a whole thing happening. So, and you've also got musicians in here as well. But I mean, this is a long-term, Michael Cunningham, a long-term kind of project. These are really in-depth interviews. You've gone to all of them and said, well, how do you create the thing you create?
So specifically, all right, just back to the painting. So I decided that I wanted to talk to artists and have them, I wanted to get inside artists' head. And I figured the best way to do it was to concentrate on a specific work. I was a little afraid of the kind of gassy way that people sometimes talk about creation because it's very hard to talk about. And I figured if we rooted it in the concrete narrative, a story, the evolution of a particular novel, painting, joke, song, play, movie, TV show, etc. There's 43 of them, and the range is pretty vast. And then that might yield something that was useful to me and maybe interesting to a reader. And then I decided to build it around, which we can talk about also later, about artifacts of their work that show the artist making things that they can't lie. I was as a journalist, I was very suspicious of the ways in which people, not intentionally, but that they have a spiel and they give the spiel. And I wanted to get an honest and somewhat psychologically laden narrative of how they came to make the thing that they made, as well as practical steps that they took, decisions they made, bad decisions they made, failure they felt, everything that finally led through twists and turns to the making of the thing. So I started with some personal heroes of mine. I started with Stephen Sondheim, Kara Walker, Moses Sumney. These are all people who I have been kind of devoted to in a sort of hero worship sort of way. And I was very, very excited that they said yes. And I started the journey, which took 3 years of talking to them one after another. Sometimes they would lead me to other people they thought would be interesting to try to build a book that somehow tries to understand how artists truly make art.
I also really appreciate just the range of personalities that are here. I mean, Louise Glick and David Simon. Not necessarily a pairing I would have automatically thought of.
No, Louise Glick and there's a drag queen in here.
Yeah.
Named Dina Martina. Yes, it's a big range. And that range to some extent is my own personal range of my own taste and interest, but also it was part of my kind of hypothesis. Is like, is it the same to, write a 10-second joke as it is to write a novel that may take 10 years? And the book was a search to understand what all those things might share.
Yeah, I don't think the muscles are all that different. I think time is sort of one of these things where, great, you can do interiority and time in a novel in a way that you can't necessarily in a song or on the screen or on, canvas, right? But at the same time, the experience of whatever the creative process is, and I want to talk to you about process because I know it's a word you don't love, but it is, well, it's accurate, right? Like everyone has a different process for what they do.
It describes an evolution of a thing from the subtitle says from nothing to something.
Well, and I'm going to quote you for a second. You have this great line, and it's actually at the end of the book, but this is not a spoiler, people. Art has a before and it has an after. And I loved going through, and I've read the book 2 different ways already. So I read it straight through the first time because I was like, what have I gotten myself into? And then the second time I went back and I sort of just noodled. And the way you would if you were flipping through it on someone's coffee table, right?
Yeah.
And the sense of discovery that I got to have in 2 different ways, right? Like, it's partially because it's an anthology, right? It's also partially the subject because, you can be pleasantly surprised. And also there are names in the book that I just didn't know. And I was like, well, they're here for a reason, so I'm just going to go read the thing. I mean, so of course, the second time when I went back, I sort of started with all of the people that I know and love and really have engaged with their work in a different way. And then I was like, but who are all of these strangers? And so to have that sense of discovery is so delightful.
Oh, that's so great. I mean, my personal wish is that everyone read the book from beginning to end, because I do feel that there are some kind of like Easter eggy kind of stuff that I put in the book that create a kind of almost subtle motion from beginning to end. But honestly, nobody reads the book that way. So you are
I did
one
once.
of the few. The book is meant, it's meant to be a book of joy. People dive in wherever they dive in. They dive in at someone that they happen to be a fan of. They dive in because they want to paint, so they look at the painters, or they want to write a novel, so they look at the novelists. They have all sorts of different reasons, or they flip through. And since the book is so visual, there are certain kind of visual stimuli that may excite people in some ways. But the book has such a range because my curiosity was fairly undisciplined. It was, it just kind of went. It went toward all things that I could, in some way, think of as making art, and that was a mystery to me before I got there. Because I should say that it's like I could say that I spent my whole career working in a group. That's what magazine making is. It's a collaboration. And in this case, I was trying to, and where the thing is made because people bounce off each other and the conversation is out loud. And in all of these cases, whether that case is, someone writing a poem or, or someone cooking something, it's a conversation they have with themselves. It's really talking to yourself, which actually was one of the 10,000 things titles that almost came to be. But yes, we can think about my process, sure.
I'm glad we have the title we have instead of, I understand the ethos of talking to oneself, but I'm glad we have the title we have. But it is a really intimate book. I mean, I'm actually not surprised that you got people, because you're who you are and have had this long career in journalism, but that you were able to convince people to show you the inner workings, right? Like, I mean, sure, Michael Cunningham knows and George Saunders knows some days their papers will be, if they haven't already sold them yet, their papers will be, picked over by scholars and whatnot. But you were sitting there in their living room with them.
Yeah.
As Michael Cunningham walks you through the germination of the hours.
Yeah. I should say a couple of things. One is that not everybody said yes to me. So the people who did were the people who were as curious about how they made the thing as I was. They were people bent on a kind of self-analysis. And in fact, so many people said, "Oh my God, this is like psychotherapy." So I was in a sense playing a kind of therapist role. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was I did most of these conversations during COVID. So people were in a kind of reflective mode.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a whole lot else going on. So they were very interested in my project, which really became our project together. They were all really collaborators with me to try to figure out this thing that they didn't themselves. Tony Kushner said, I write something good sometimes, and I wonder, how did that happen? That is really a kind of universally felt, if not expressed, feeling by all the artists in the book. How did this happen? How was I able to do this?
You're also doing a dance, though, between criticism and creation in each of these essays. And sometimes it's you being the critic. Sometimes it's the actual creator of the thing. And I'm using creator because we're talking about musicians and writers and painters and, there's a lot happening. So I'm just going to use creator sort of as a general term. But I really like that interchange. The idea that you can be both.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's the context, right?
Also, I think, so I could be both, but also they could be both.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Important, in that before and after aspect of making art, there's this there's a structure to how someone creates something. And one crucial step in that structure, which is seldom discussed or understood, is judgment, is the way you judge your own work. Is you spew whatever undigested stuff is in your brain somewhere that is the raw material for how you make something. But then if you're any good at this, what you do is you just look at what it is your imagination has just barfed out, and you are able to judge what to save and what to get rid of, and then to develop a strategy. So you are your own critic, and how you handle your own critical ability, one, how sharp you are as a critic, and two, how both stern and forgiving you are as a critic. Because if you say, no, this is all just crap, and walk away, then the thing will never happen. If you say, it's not all working, or it's not all interesting, but this maybe is, and I'm not going to annihilate myself because some of it repels me for whatever reason. Repels me because it isn't any good, or repels me because it's really talking about something too deep and yucky to talk about. So this self-criticism part is, I think, just a big part of making art. And and as you said before, the structure is always the same. That's true whether you're making a joke or, I mean, you are, whether you know it or not, it happens in a split second. You are rejecting a whole number of ways to make your jokey utterance at a dinner table before anything comes out of your mouth. You're being your own critic right there. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because any art needs context.
Yes.
Right? And any piece of criticism also needs context, or is the context. I mean, art doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? We don't exist in a vacuum. And it's kind of why humor can be hard. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
humor doesn't always work on the page, and you look at something and you're like, I know that was funny in 1975, but wow.
Uh-huh.
Wow, that was a really long time ago, and that has aged like, milk. It's seeing sort of the wider lens,
Mm-hmm.
as it were, in each of these pieces. But when you're working, and I know because you've always worked with a deeply visual medium, right? Magazines are
Mm-hmm.
sort of the ultimate visual medium. Do you ever sort of separate how you respond to the visual versus the written word? I mean, are there two halves of your brain that respond separately, or do you just not need to do that and you just know how the thing works as a whole?
I don't think they're two separate
Okay.
things. For me, I think it's more that I have a response. And I think that, if you've been editing for a while, you begin to sharpen your appreciation for your response. You can interpret what it is you're viscerally responding to and figure out a way to make that productive in terms of helping the thing get better. And, it's true in the visual realm. I can't really take a picture, so I can't go in there and I can only sort of talk to a photographer about what I think might happen here. In the written part, well, I can do that a little bit better.
Hmm.
Although I'm also I have my severe limitations in that side too. It's basically understanding and interpreting your own response and then figuring out what to do about it.
So is this where the artifacts come in though? Because there are some very cool illustrations
Yeah. I
throughout
mean,
work of
I
art.
think
And I'm kind of amazed what people were like, okay, go ahead, take a photo of this, put it in the book.
Yeah, it's funny that but they, I asked them to go and ransack their disk drives and, open up big bags of garbage to find stuff that was a record of this. And I have always loved these kinds of artifacts. I've always loved unfinished paintings or musicians' lyrics on hotel stationery, where they're writing a lyric and you can actually see their brain in motion. You could see the cross out and you could see the new word that they put in. You're almost there in real time, which I find amazing. But yeah, in this book, Amy Silman, the painter, the fabulous abstract painter, showed me, well, really hundreds, but I published 39 iterations of a painting which was wiped out like 3 times in the course of the painting. She just would do something and then she'd like tear it up and start again, and you could see the evolution of her thinking and of her painting. There's one category of things that I love, which are sort of notes to self, where George Saunders or Michael Cunningham in particular did this. They wrote notes to themselves as if they were a third party. Well, have you thought about doing this? Or maybe you should call it the hours.
Hmm.
Michael says at one point. Then there are like these weird maps and codes that even at this point the artist like Sheila Heti could not even understand
Hmm.
what it was she used, but she created this entire sort of tarot system,
Yeah.
which would help her write the book How Should a Person Be? And those, and then they're like, Thomas Bartlett shared with me the whole text message exchange he had in the producing writing of a particular song. There's every which way. Louise Glick, had little torn up fragments of where she wrote lines of her poem. One of the real pleasures for me was to show the artists these things that they sent me, which they hadn't necessarily looked at when they sent them. And it jogged their memory in a way that was very, it got to the heart of the thing. They were able to, oh yeah, at this moment, I had that as a dream. That was a line. This is actually what Louise Gluck said to me. Glick said to me, this is a line I had in a dream, and I can't explain to you why this line was so. You read this line and it seems ordinary, but to me it just opened up a whole world, and it becomes a kind of prompt uh, for an authentic version of how that, in her case, this poem song got written.
Do you have an answer now for what the work of art is?
I would say, first of all, we should say for the listener, viewer, whatever, that work is meant in every which way, but it's really meant as the labor of art. That's what I was trying to document. How is it that artists actually work? The work of art, I mean, there's these sort of abstract version of what the work of art is, I mean, the abstract description of it is that it is kind of hacking your way through failure. Um, a an artist, if they take any risks, then they won't make anything if they don't take risks. They will go down wrong paths over and over and over again. And how they pick themselves up after failure is kind of what renders art possible or not. So it's that, it's patience through tedium, because a lot of making art is actually tedious, something that people like me who have very romantic ideas about what making art are, it's a hard thing to grasp how much actual work it is, and it's obsession. I mean, obsession's a much bandied about word, but you need drive. Too many things are there to subvert you as you go along the path. And so you need to have a reason to keep going. And basically, the reason in all of these cases is that something will not let them go. They had a lot of perfectly good ideas beforehand. They share with me the ideas they rejected, and they're great, but they didn't take hold in the same way. They weren't necessary. And for them, it's just this, it's almost sort of acting on compulsion. And they just feel compelled to move through this process in a way that I had to admit at the end, I don't feel necessarily. I don't have that same kind of truly maniacal focus and purpose toward the making of a thing. They have to make it. Susan Laurie Parks, the playwright, said, if I'm not working in this way, it's as if I'm not breathing. And I think that was a true statement from her.
But looking back on your magazine career, part of me is thinking, wait a minute, really? That sounds exactly like how you approached making magazines. And it just, maybe the painting wasn't quite the same zhuzh as the making of magazines. But I mean,
I was very obsessive about making magazines. Yes, that is true. But at a certain point, I became less obsessive, and that's when I had to leave. I couldn't make it if I didn't wake up in the morning driven in a way that was very neurotic, perhaps even psychotic. And so I had to make it, and I had to make it in a certain way. But also it was something, as I said before, that I did with other people. So there was a kind of companionship to it that made it go down easier. These people are by themselves for the most part. They're in this kind of solitary cocoon, which is, I'm suspicious of the thought that all artists are crazy, mad geniuses. But there is a little something maddening about being in a room by themselves, having to finish this thing that is driving them.
I think you have to also have a little bit of just the willingness to take a leap of faith, right? And I don't mean faith in the, religious sense of the word, but more the idea that there is something here and there is something to be gained. And I don't think it's 100%. Madness. I just think it's, that the work itself is the thing. Like, I mean, I meet people everywhere all the time who are just like, well, I have a book in me. And I'm like, that's great. Or, and you've met them too. Like, we've all met them, people who are just like, well, I'm going to write a book and I'll be famous. And I'm like, well, that's kind of not how it works, but rock on. Whatever gets you to sit down and do the thing. But every working writer I know will say it really is about the discipline. And sometimes the discipline is 10,000 words in a day. And sometimes I'm lucky if I get a sentence that doesn't make me barf. I mean, but it's the work.
And it kind of doesn't matter as long as they are I don't want my description of madness to be misinterpreted, because I don't believe in the madness in the attic kind of thing. But I do believe there's something kind of unusual in a person's psychology where they can't let something go. It's something that we pathologize in other contexts. It's a kind of mania.
I want to go back to your career in magazines, though, because I miss magazines. I miss getting those really fat issues in the fall, leading up to holiday and everything. Because half of the time was like, who's advertising what and what are they doing and what are the visuals and where are the stories being sort of put in around them. And there really was sort of a golden age of magazines.
There were several
And
actually. Yeah, but
yeah,
but perhaps when you loved them, I also loved them, and that was a wonderful period.
yeah, there was so much going on. And also, this is obviously pre internet in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying the internet doesn't have its place because you actually walked that line in a way that a lot of other folks did not. And I want to go back specifically to New York Magazine because you're responsible for Vulture being its own site. You're responsible for The Cut and The Strategist and Grub Street. And I'm missing something. What am I missing?
Intelligencer, yeah.
Thank you, Intelligencer. All being integrated. Because I remember when New York sort of launched its website and we were all kind of like, oh, this is, what do we do with this? Right. And suddenly we had more stuff. It was really voicey. Like there are people now who sort of came up imitating what you guys were doing. And some of them have survived and some of them have not. But you figured out kind of early on how to pivot. And that's a word I don't love. But since we're using words we don't necessarily
we don't
love
love
in this
but say what they
episode.
say, yeah.
Right. Sometimes you just got to go with the most accurate thing.
Yeah.
When did you start to sort of figure out that that's the direction you were taking this? Because also New York Magazine, storied history. I mean, some of the best new journal, I mean, and the stuff that Clay Shirky was doing. I mean,
Clay Felker,
Clay Felker, I'm so sorry. It had its place sort of in the pantheon, right? And here you are and you're like, well, I have this legacy to manage and I have this thing to take care of, but I'm also going to shove you into a new world. And it was kind of exciting to watch.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know whether I shoved people into a new world or whether the new world shoved us, because I had been at the New York Times Magazine before I was at New York, and they were actually pretty early adapters to the internet. And I watched as they started to sort of change the focus of the institution towards making stuff online. And I was kind of impressed by it. And we did it at the Times Magazine, an issue immediately after 9/11 that was, I thought, a kind of amazing magazine. That really, I can say that because it was kind of me standing back and just watching it happen. There were so many people who wanted to figure out how to mark the moment. And it was just a question of managing all their amazing creative work. We put this into the issue. The issue was going to sit there because of the time lag of the New York Times Magazine, which was there for 10 days. And that was too frustrating. We had something to say and we wanted to say it right now. So I realized that the Times had a website. And I could just take the whole issue and in effect scoop ourselves, make the print issue moot in order to, and putting it or sort of moot and put it online. And we did that. And so when I entered New York Magazine, which was several years later, I came into New York Magazine with a sense that this is where things were going. And also I wasn't afraid of it. And a lot of my magazine brethren were afraid of it, but it was very directly. It had to do with many different projects I did at the Times that made me think, this is interesting. There's so many other ways to tell stories than just in print media, which I loved print magazines. I mean, I really loved them. But look, you could reach gazillion more people online, have moving pictures, you could have sound. What we're doing right now.
I know. It was unthinkable. It was unthinkable back in the day, right?
Print magazine. You could have stories that didn't have a beginning and end, and you could sort of walk to someone's door. This was actually a story we did called One Block, where you just would enter into it was a block in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, and that we were doing a story on gentrification, and you could just enter into a house on this block and walk back in history through the entire history of this location. It was amazing. And you couldn't do that in print. We did actually do a version of it in print, and it was kind of flat in print. So that was all exciting to me. And then we realized we had restaurant listings, which is something that you could do digitally, because that was, it was great reference tool. And we realized if we started to do stories there and we spoke in the voice of the magazine, but just about food, that we had actually a whole magazine, and that became Grub Street. And then once we saw what Grub Street did, it wasn't too long to figure out, well, we could take the culture part of New York Magazine and make it its own world. And that became Vulture. And then The Cut was true for it started as a strictly speaking fashion site, but then soon became a site about the whole realm of women's interests, politics, more personal stuff, and style. And then Intelligencer was our political content. We hired a whole mess of some of the best political writers living. And those were, and then we did a whole mess of the great thing about that, there's no cost to entry to putting these magazines online. So that we probably did like 30 different magazines. And the ones that you just mentioned before are the ones that survive. But the fun of constantly trying stuff and experimenting with it and seeing if it took in some way was one of the joys of my time there.
And I still think of it all as voice, right? Like magazines have an identity, they have a voice, and art always has a voice, whether it's someone writing a play, whether it is someone writing a musical or a piece of music, any of these things, art always has a voice. And
absolutely. And the voice is often the very first step. You get the voice right, then what will happen will frequently happen because of that sound, that look, that imprint that the artist brings to it.
Well, and also it changes how we interact with art too. I was back at the Met for the first time in a really long time about a month ago and just sort of wandering through. And there are pieces there that I've seen 1,000 times. I'm really fortunate to live in a city that has a great museum. And there's some pieces where you're like, oh, right, I just haven't looked at this sort of in the flesh, as it were, in a really long time. And it does change the experience because art doesn't always reproduce well.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
I mean, the first time I saw Mademoiselle d'Avignon in a page of a book, I was like, well, that's kind of, who cares? And then you see it in real life and you're like, oh, that's why that broke everyone's brain, because when you see it in real life and you see the physicality of it. And then if you go to Lockman now, there's a small exhibit of Picasso drawings and statues and whatnot. And whoever's writing the notes that go on the wall next to things has a really fabulous point of view. And all I can say is go to Lockman, go to the Picasso room, go look at it. Is very funny because, now we have a slightly different understanding of Picasso.
Yes, we do. I'm glad to hear that because wall text is so frustrating generally.
It is usually, I tend to err on the side of making fun of it. Apologies, curators. I know you have a job to do and whatnot, but sometimes you're reading a piece and you're just thinking, okay, I'm glad I didn't have to write that. But every now and again, someone slides something. I actually took photos of it and sent it to friends. I was like, in case you are not going to be in Los Angeles soon.
Oh, you should send it to me. That's great.
I will, actually. You would appreciate it. It is very, very funny. But again, I love the idea that we can change how we appreciate art. I mean, I think the first time I read Angels in America, and I have not seen Angels in America on the stage. I've seen the HBO adaptation. And I've read it, but, the first time I read it, I probably didn't have all of the reference points that I have now, just with time and experience in life and everything else. And now it's just a completely different experience, right? The same, Michael Cunningham brought me back to Virginia Woolf with the hours because, snotty 20-year-old, sometimes you need a little bump to get back to something, right? Did putting this book together, though, change the way you interact with the art of the people that are in the book, or are you just kind of enjoying having this beautiful object?
I'm always fascinated with how something came to be. I mean, I in my life, I was committed to this whole field of process journalism, which is like, how things are born. To me, it's like an unbelievable narrative. The story of it started with nothing. Where did that come from? Started with absolutely nothing and gets to the final thing. So I think that understanding its path really can enrich your appreciation of the thing that came to be. Understanding things that it wasn't can really help you appreciate all the things that it became. So I'd say in every case, I have much greater appreciation for the thing at the end. Things that I really love, I seek out some sense of its origin story, and I don't find it. One of the
Right.
things I hope that my book does. I mean, you find it sometimes, but one of the things I hope the book does is it sort of spurs an appetite for this genre. Really, it's like, how did this happen? One reads a gazillion books all the time about how the founders came to write the Constitution or something. But the story of how an art work comes into being, I'm not going to pretend it doesn't happen at all, but it seldom do you read it because artists are very superstitious generally about sharing it. They don't understand where their spark comes from. They don't understand, as Kara Walker said, how the switch goes on. And so they're superstitious about, jinxing the muse. I had seen the Beatles documentary, the Peter Jackson. You remember that? And there's the
Yep.
great moment when you watch Paul McCartney get back right in front of the camera, where the first words get back, and it's magic. So that's kind of what I tried to recreate backwards, in a two-dimensional form like a book is. It can't happen exactly, but I tried as hard as I could to try to recreate the moment of emergence and bring it to the reader.
There's also something to be said for holding the object in your hand as you're reading about the creation of an object. I mean,
That's cool.
The paper is really heavy.
Yeah.
The fabric on the jacket, there's no dust jacket. Like it's not paper
Yeah.
overboard, it's fabric overboard. It's a really satisfying objet to hold. And I will read across formats, I'll listen to audiobooks. I mean, sometimes you just need to do the work, right? And sometimes you just want to sit with a thing.
Yeah.
Because it's beautiful. And yeah, the words are great, but sometimes you just want to have a beautiful thing.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that was certainly, I wanted to make something that people wanted to have around very much, that they would go back to all the time, that they were proud to have other people look at. So it's a weird book.
It's a very cool, weird book. It's fun. And I mean, David Simon has this phrase that I'm going to co-opt, and I'm not exactly using it the way he uses it in the book, but he's talking about bounce.
Yeah,
and the bounce he gets when he's working with other people. And I'm like, oh, this is a giant book that bounces. Like the story the concept. I mean, yeah, it sort of starts as a high concept thing, but the sense of play and the sense of joy and discovery and bounce. I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of exactly. And my understanding of David Simon is he's not really the lightest guy to be around. I've heard varying reports, but the idea of even a guy like that going, well, no, bounce is important. You have to have bounce when it comes to storytelling. I'm like, oh, see, even the ex-reporter from the Baltimore, like the guy who covered crime, and created The Wire, even he gets that we've got to have.
Well, he's just, it was, actually, I should say that the term bounce was not his. It was someone else's.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Describing how he works, but it was something but it was a description of how he works that he was all in on. And actually, I'm glad you respond to that word, because I did too. It's the way I work too. It's that, you make something by, you bounce a ball, and it when you bounce that ball, it goes faster.
Yeah.
And that's just the physics of it. And it creates energy. That's how beautiful things can get made.
Yeah, it's very cool. We've been talking so much about other people's work and your past life as a journalist, but I want to come back to the painting for a second, because and I think you said this to Debbie Millman, that you were just kind of like, well, I'm going to put my ambition on the shelf. I'm paraphrasing you, but I'm going to put my ambition on the shelf, and I'm going to go do something else. And, you sort of explained the painting to us at the top of the show. Well, one, are you still painting? And two, are you approaching it differently? Are you approaching your own art and the painting differently now that you've spent all of this time with all of these other creatives?
Yeah.
And all of the words and all of the images and everything else. I mean, creating a book is not a small thing.
No, it certainly isn't. And I learned how to, I learned how to make, I'd never written a book before.
Right.
I learned in this process doing the book, I learned how to write a book. I mean, I wrote a whole book that I had to throw away. I wrote the way I thought a book ought to sound. And
Yeah.
that was deadly. And when I finally figured out my own voice, just to go back to that, I had to rewrite the whole book in my own voice. Also, I had one sort of visual idea in mind that just was never going to work in a physical book, and so Enneagram introduced this kind of very cool arrow system that it was I thought like layered and beautiful, and also turned the book into the diagram I was describing before. But back to the painting. I sort of hoped that the book itself would make me a better painter. It did.
Oh, it didn't.
It did not. However, there was something that happened, which is that I went in each case to every artist, and as a storyteller, by trade, I wanted a big aha conclusion. And I asked each of them, I wanted them to get to the end of the making of the thing that they were making. And I wanted to feel from them a great sense of catharsis, a great hurrah, fireworks. No one gave that to me. No one experienced. They felt relieved. They tend to like these works that are many of which people consider classics. But what they did the next day is go back and do the next thing. Because as they kept saying to me, it wasn't about the work, capital W, it was about the work, small w. And that's what I took to my painting. I was no longer preoccupied or tortured by the mediocrity that I was able to produce. Instead, I felt the joy and the absorption in the making of the thing. And I still feel that. And every day, I'm able to give myself, I paint every day. And every day I'm able to give myself that enthralling, sort of ecstatic sense, no matter what I'm putting on the canvas, of a mark that delights me, or of something that has given me joy. And so I approach my art making not as an enterprise to make something beautiful and lasting, but simply as an experience. And because of what I learned in the book, it's now a wonderful experience for me.
That seems like a really cool place to end this episode. Adam Moss, thank you so much. Work of Art is out now, and I'm so glad that you have peace with your painting. That makes me really happy to hear
peace
that.
With my painting. Oh my God.
That makes me really happy. That's very cool. Thank you again for joining us on Poured Over.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.